My parents left my 5-year-old son alone in a locked car under the Arizona sun for nearly 4 hours. I didn't hear it from them. I heard it in the steady, practiced voice of a hospital nurse who wouldn't say the word critical, but paused long enough for it to hang in the air. I remember the heat outside the building when I arrived, how it pressed against my skin, how my hands shook when I signed my name. The car had stayed sealed. The windows never cracked. Time just kept moving. My son's small body stayed where they told him to wait. When I finally saw him, his eyelashes were clumped with sweat. His lips were dry. He didn't cry. He looked at me like he was still trying to understand what rule he had broken. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this story feels worth your time. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm grateful you're here with me. Now let me take you back to the moment everything started to unravel. I stayed with that look in his eyes longer than I meant to. Then I stepped back into the hallway and my phone began to feel heavier in my hand, like it had already known what was coming. Earlier that day, I had been sitting across a glass table from a client, nodding at numbers on a screen, pretending my mind wasn't drifting. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Someone was explaining timelines. That was when my phone vibrated once, then stopped. A second later it rang. An unfamiliar number. Scottsdale area code. I almost ignored it. I didn't. The woman on the other end spoke carefully, like each word had weight. She said her name, then said she was calling from Honor Health Medical Center. She asked if I was Caleb's mother. I remember how quiet the room felt when I stood up, how every sound seemed to drop away, as she said my son had been brought in with heat-related injuries. Heat shock. Those words landed wrong, like they belonged to another family. She told me he was stable. Temporarily. Her voice dipped at the end of the sentence just enough to tell me there was more she wasn't saying. I asked how long he'd been there. She didn't answer directly. She asked where I was, and whether I could come immediately. Before I could say anything else, the phone changed hands. A man introduced himself as a police officer. His tone was neutral, almost gentle. He asked me to confirm my name. Then he asked if I owned a silver SUV registered in Arizona. I said yes, and my mouth went dry before he said another word. I saw it all at once. Morning light in my parents' driveway. My father tapping the hood of the car like it was a promise. My mother smiling, saying they'd take Caleb out for a family lunch, give me a quiet day to work. I had hesitated for a second. Just a second. Then I handed over the keys. I asked the officer where my son had been found. He told me it was a parking lot outside an electronics store, the kind with wide asphalt and no shade. He said a delivery driver heard a sound he couldn't place at first. A soft, irregular tapping. When he got closer, he heard it again. That's when he called 911. I don't remember ending the meeting. I don't remember the elevator ride down. I remember my hands shaking so badly I had to sit in my car for a moment before I could start it. I called my parents. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Then again. I called my sister Angela. Nothing. Each unanswered ring felt deliberate, like time stretching just to hurt me. At the hospital, the air conditioning hit my skin too hard. A uniformed officer stopped me before I reached the nurse's station and asked me to sit. He said they needed a statement. Just a few questions. My leg bounced uncontrollably against the chair. I kept looking down the hallway, expecting someone to tell me there had been a mistake. When he finished, he nodded once and said, I could see my son now. But by then, I already knew something irreversible had happened. Not just to Caleb's body, to the shape of our family, to the space where trust used to live. They led me through a set of double doors that closed too softly behind us. The hallway was dimmer there, the kind of light meant to calm people down. It didn't work. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath since the phone call, and only just noticed. Caleb had been trapped in the car for nearly 4 hours. Outside, the temperature had reached 106 degrees, 41 Celsius. Someone said it the way people say facts they've learned to repeat without feeling them. Inside the vehicle, investigators later estimated the heat climbed past 150. 65 Celsius, numbers that don't belong anywhere near a child's body. When the paramedics arrived, the car was still sealed, doors locked, windows fully up, no crack of mercy. I tried to imagine the moment they broke the glass, the sound it made in that empty parking lot, and my mind refused to finish the picture. It kept stopping at the heat, the stillness, the waiting. Caleb lay on the hospital bed with wires across his chest and a monitor humming beside him. His skin looked too flushed, stretched tight over his cheeks. His lips were pale, almost chalky. When I touched his hand, it was cool from the IV fluids, but his fingers twitched like they were still searching for something solid. A doctor stood beside me, his voice steady, practiced. Dr. Kevin Howard. He explained dehydration, heat stress, the strain on Caleb's heart. He said they'd cooled him gradually to avoid shock, that they were watching his vitals closely. Then he paused. Just long enough. He told me if help had arrived 20 minutes later, the outcome could have been irreversible. Brain damage, organ failure. Words that didn't raise their voices but stayed with weight. Caleb stirred when he heard mine. His eyes opened halfway. He didn't cry. He whispered instead, like he was confessing something. He told me Grandpa said to stay in the car because he was being too loud. He said he tried to be quiet after that. He said he thought if he was good, they would come back soon. I nodded while he spoke. I told him he did exactly what he was told. I didn't tell him that obedience had almost killed him. A nurse adjusted the IV and checked his temperature again. Somewhere behind me, a clipboard changed hands. I heard the word protocol, then mandatory report. I didn't turn around. I already knew what it meant. When a child comes in like this, the hospital doesn't ask permission. They call Child Protective Services. It's automatic. A safeguard built on other families' disasters. Part of me felt relief at that. Another part felt the quiet dread of knowing this story was no longer just ours. I sat there and watched the monitor rise and fall with each breath. I listened to the soft beep that meant his heart was still fighting. I thought about the car, the asphalt, the time slipping by unnoticed. About how a child can believe so deeply in the promise that someone will return. That was when the weight finally settled. Not as panic, not as anger, as certainty. Something had been broken open and there was no way to put it back the way it was before. I stayed with Caleb until the machine settled into a rhythm I could almost trust. When his breathing evened out, I stepped into the hallway and finally looked at my phone again. 12 missed calls, all mine, no replies. Then, as if on cue, it rang. It was my mother. Her voice came through sharp and irritated, already mid-sentence, already convinced she was the one inconvenienced. She said the car was gone. She said they'd come out of the store and it just wasn't there. She asked if I'd moved it, if I'd forgotten to tell them something important. Her anger moved faster than my shock. I told her Caleb was in the hospital. There was a pause, brief and brittle, like a line stretched too tight. Then she laughed once, not kindly. She said that couldn't be right. She said I must be confused. She asked if I was feeling okay. The words landed clean and cold. It felt like being corrected instead of heard. I told her again. Slower this time. I said his name. I said emergency room. I said heat. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice lowered, firm corrective. She said, children exaggerate. She said Caleb had been fussy all morning. She said he gets overwhelmed easily. My father took the phone from her. I could tell by the way the background noise shifted, by the scrape of something being set down. He spoke like this was a problem that just needed better framing. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said no one would intentionally hurt their own grandson. He said Caleb has always been difficult to manage, that I know that, don't I? They both insisted the car had been parked in the shade. They said it was behind the building, that the sun didn't hit it directly. They said they were only gone for a little while. Just long enough to run an errand. Just long enough to grab a few things. Time shrank in their telling, folded into something harmless. They explained they didn't realize anything was wrong until they came back and the car wasn't there. That was when they panicked. That was when they thought it had been stolen. They talked about filing a report. About how upsetting it was. About how frightened they'd been. Not once did they ask how Caleb was doing. I stood in the hallway, the phone pressed against my ear, watching a nurse walk past with a chart tucked to her chest. I watched a man lean against the wall and rub his eyes. The hospital moved around me, efficient and quiet. My parents kept talking, circling the same points, polishing them until they sounded almost reasonable. I told them a delivery driver had found Caleb. I told them the windows were up. I told them the doctors said he'd been minutes away from something permanent. My mother went silent then. My father cleared his throat. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them said his name. What they didn't know or refused to acknowledge was how close they had come to losing him. How close I had come to walking into a room that would never let me walk out the same. They spoke as if this was an inconvenience, a series of unfortunate events that could be smoothed over with the right explanation. When the call ended, the silence felt heavier than before. I looked through the glass at my son, small and still beneath white sheets, and understood something with absolute clarity. They were telling a story where no one was truly at fault. I was standing in the middle of one where my child had almost died. I didn't hang up angry. I hung up hollow, the kind of quiet that settles in after something important has already been decided without you. It was later that evening when my mother called again. The hallway lights had dimmed. Caleb was asleep, finally, his chest rising in shallow, careful breaths. I stepped into the stairwell so my voice wouldn't reach him. She didn't ask how he was. She told me what I needed to do. She said I should tell the police I'd been there, that I'd stepped inside the store for a few minutes and left Caleb in the car myself. She said it calmly, like we were rearranging details on a form that had already been filled out wrong. She reminded me the car was registered in my name. She said in her words, it made the most sense if the responsibility stayed with me. I waited for something else to come after that. A pause. A softening. It didn't. She explained that Angela was weeks away from finishing her certification, that she'd worked too hard to have it taken away over a misunderstanding. She said one charge, just one related to child endangerment, would follow Angela forever. No school district would touch her. No daycare. No future. She said families protect each other. I leaned my head against the concrete wall and closed my eyes. I pictured my sister's smiling photos, her plans, her confidence. Then I pictured my son's cracked lips, the way his fingers had twitched against the hospital sheets. The comparison settled in slowly, painfully clear. My mother was asking me to place Angela's career above Caleb's life. When I didn't respond right away, her voice hardened. She said I was being dramatic. She said nothing had happened in the end. She said I was lucky. Then she said if I refused to help them, if I let this become a whole thing, she would have no choice but to cut me off. No calls, no holidays, no family. She said it like a consequence I'd chosen. I told her I needed to go. She didn't argue, she didn't have to. The line went dead with a soft click that felt final. When I went back into the room, Caleb was awake. His eyes followed me as I sat beside him. He looked smaller somehow, folded inward. He whispered my name, then paused like he was afraid to finish the thought. He said he was sorry. I asked him why. He said he thought Grandpa got mad because he was too loud. He said he tried to be quiet after that. He said maybe if he had been better, this wouldn't have happened. Something inside me broke open then. Not loudly. Not all at once. It was the quiet realization that the damage had already reached him, had found a place to settle. I wrapped my arms around him, carefully mindful of the wires, the soreness, the fear still living in his body. I told him the truth, in the only way I could. I told him he hadn't done anything wrong. I told him he hadn't been bad or difficult or too much. I told him adults are responsible for keeping children safe, not the other way around. He nodded like he was trying to believe me. His head rested against my shoulder, warm and real and alive. I stayed there long after he fell asleep again. My phone sat face down on the chair beside me. I didn't turn it over. I didn't need to. By then I understood what my mother was really asking. And I knew with a clarity that frightened me that there was no version of this where I could protect everyone. The room was still when morning came. That particular hospital quiet that isn't, rest just a pause between alarms. Pale light pressed through the blinds and rested on Caleb's face. He looked older and sleep thinner around the eyes, like something had been taken and not yet returned. I sat there and understood finally that there were two roles I could not carry at the same time. I could be a dutiful daughter, smoothing things over, absorbing blame, keeping the shape of the family intact. Or I could be a mother in the only way that mattered. There was no careful middle, no compromise that didn't cost him. The thought didn't arrive with drama. It settled the way heavy things do, slow and undeniable. I chose to be a mother. That choice didn't feel brave. It felt cold. Practical. Like closing a door you know won't open again once you hear the latch catch. After Caleb drifted back to sleep, I stepped out into the hallway and made a call. The hospital social worker had given me a name the night before, slid it across the table without comment. An independent attorney. No ties. No favors owed. I left a message, my voice steady enough to surprise me, and said I needed guidance. I didn't say from whom. By mid-morning, I was no longer waiting. I was doing. I pulled my phone from my bag and began saving everything. Screenshots of messages I'd ignored at first. Call logs that showed patterns I'd never questioned. The location history of the SUV time-stamped and precise, each stop a quiet witness. I emailed copies to myself, then to a new folder I named Nothing at All. I wrote things down by hand, too. Dates, times, exact phrases I remembered because they hadn't faded. I didn't trust memory alone anymore. Memory bends under pressure. Records don't. While I worked, I noticed how my body felt. Not calm, not frantic. Just alert, like something finally aligned. My shoulders stopped creeping toward my ears. My hands didn't shake. It scared me a little how clear everything looked once I stopped trying to protect the wrong people. I thought about my parents, about how easily they'd asked me to carry this, how quickly they'd decided what my role was meant to be. I thought about Angela's future, the one I was supposed to sacrifice my son for, and how none of them had asked what this would do to him. Not later. Not ever. The truth settled in another way then. If I stayed quiet, this wouldn't be the end of it. Silence teaches people what they can get away with. It teaches them whose lives count less. Today, it had been my child. Next time, it could be another. Different car, different parking lot. Same certainty that someone else would absorb the damage. I went back into the room and watched Caleb sleep. His fingers curled loosely now, no longer clenched. Machines hummed beside him, patient and indifferent. I memorized the rise and fall of his chest, the weight of his breath. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't imagine justice arriving cleanly or quickly. I only knew this, whatever followed, would not be built on a lie spoken for convenience. It would be built on what happened, on what almost didn't end here. I sat down beside him and stayed. That was the first thing I did right. By the time I started looking for proof, I wasn't angry anymore. That part had burned out. What was left was something colder, methodical, almost quiet. I moved through the days on autopilot, feeding Caleb, answering questions from nurses and social workers, nodding when appropriate. At night, when he finally slept with his hand curled into my shirt, I opened my laptop and began to look. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe something small enough that my mother could explain away. But the first thing that surfaced felt like a physical blow. Angela's social media account was public. It always had been. She liked documenting her life. Neat shelves, polished nails, sunlight on cafe tables. Scrolling back a few days, I found it without effort. A photo of her reflection in a store mirror. Shopping bags at her feet. A caption about treating herself after a long week. The timestamp sat there in small gray text beneath the image. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. It was the same window of time the emergency report listed. The same hours the doctors said Caleb's body temperature had climbed trapped in metal and glass. While my son was screaming until he couldn't anymore, my sister was choosing between brands. I kept scrolling. Another photo. Lunch plates. A table set for two. My parents had shared it from her account, adding their own caption, a perfect midday moment. A heart emoji? A sun? I remember noticing with a strange sense of detachment how carefully framed the pictures were. No children, no car seats, no shadows that didn't belong. Caleb didn't exist in any of them. I checked the times again. I wrote them down by hand even though they were already saved digitally. Habit maybe. Or fear that if I didn't anchor them somehow they would slip away and take the truth with them. The hospital records were precise. Arrival time, intake, the moment a nurse hit the alarm button. When I laid those facts beside the posts, they lined up with a precision that made my stomach turn. There was no overlap. No gap Angela could step into and claim she'd been there watching him, protecting him. Then I pulled the vehicle data. The car was in my name. That was why my mother had chosen me for her request. She thought ownership meant control. What she hadn't considered was that ownership also meant records. The location history showed the car parked in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. No ignition, no movement. A single red dot that never shifted. I zoomed in until the map blurred as if proximity could soften what it was telling me. It didn't. I sat at the kitchen table while Caleb slept in the next room, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt strangely calm as I began assembling everything, screenshots labeled by date, hospital logs, the location timeline. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. Each file slipped into its folder with a dull sense of inevitability. This wasn't about proving someone wrong anymore. It was about acknowledging what was already there. When I finished, I looked at the folder on my desktop. It had a name plain and unemotional. Inside it was a version of my family I could no longer unsee. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time listening for Caleb's breathing. Steady. Alive. That was the only thing that mattered. Everything else had already been decided. I didn't sleep the night before I gave my statement. Not because I was afraid of what would happen, but because my body had finally understood there was no way back. By morning, I felt hollowed out clean in a way that scared me. The police station smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. Officer Sean Bradley led me down a narrow hallway into a small room with padded walls and a single table bolted to the floor. A red light blinked on the recording device in the corner. He asked if I needed water. I shook my head. My hands were steady. That surprised me. When he started the recorder, his voice softened. He said my name, the date, the time. Then he asked me to begin wherever it made sense. So I did. I told him about lending my car. How it wasn't unusual. How my mother had framed it as a favor, temporary, harmless. I described the morning I handed over the keys, the way Angela avoided my eyes, the way Caleb had been buckled in without a word. I moved slowly, detail by detail, the way you do when you're afraid that skipping something might unravel the whole thing. I told him about the call from the hospital, the heat, the machines, the silence afterward. I told him how my mother's voice had changed when she realized the police were involved, how it sharpened, turned practical, how she asked me to say I'd been there, how she said responsibility followed ownership, as if that were a law of nature instead of something she had just invented. When I repeated her words out loud, they sounded smaller than they had in my head. Meaner, too. I described the threat. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just a calm promise that I would no longer be her daughter if I didn't cooperate. Officer Bradley didn't interrupt. He only nodded once and wrote something down. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and lowered his voice. He told me he'd handled a case like this before, a hot car, a trusted family member. Everyone insisting it was an accident until it wasn't. That one didn't end the way yours did, he said quietly. I understood what he meant. My chest tightened, but I kept going. I refused to let my voice change. I told him I wasn't there to punish anyone. I wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation or public apologies that meant nothing. I just want the truth on record, I said. And I want my son protected. When the recorder clicked off, the silence felt heavier than the room. Officer Bradley thanked me. He said I'd done the right thing, but without ceremony, without comfort. I appreciated that. 3 days passed. On the 4th afternoon, I heard a car pull up outside my house, then another. Tires on gravel, doors closing one after another. I stood at the window with Caleb on my hip and watched my family gather in my driveway like they were arriving for a reunion. My mother smoothed her jacket. My father stood stiffly beside her. Angela lingered near the car, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ground. No one knocked right away. They waited as if I might come out on my own. They finally knocked after a few minutes, soft at first, then harder, like patience wearing thin. I didn't answer right away. I shifted Caleb higher on my hip and felt his weight solid and warm, a reminder that he was here. Alive. Breathing. That was the only thing that mattered. When I opened the door, they were lined up on the porch as if they'd planned it. My parents in front. Angela a step behind, eyes already red-faced, tight with effort. It looked less like a visit and more like a meeting called, without my consent. My father spoke first. His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used when smoothing over arguments at holidays. He said we needed to talk. He said this had gone too far. He said words like misunderstanding and unfortunate accident, as if repeating them could make them true. My mother nodded beside him, hands clasped together, already performing regret without naming it. She said families handle things privately. She said outsiders didn't need to be involved. She said no one meant for anyone to get hurt. I listened without interrupting. I noticed the way Angela kept glancing at the street as if hoping someone would stop us or witness it or rescue her from the moment she knew was coming. When there was a pause, I spoke. I said it wasn't an accident. I said it was a decision. A series of them, actually. To lock the doors. To walk away. To stay gone. To choose comfort and convenience over a child who couldn't open a door or call for help. The word choice landed between us like something heavy. No one reached for it. Angela broke first. She stepped forward, tears spilling fast, now messy and loud. She said I was ruining her life. She said I didn't understand how hard she'd worked, how close she was to finishing, how one charge could erase everything she'd built. She didn't mention Caleb's name. My mother reached out, then touching my arm like she used to when I was small. Her voice dropped, turned intimate. She said blood mattered. She said sisters forgave each other. She said I would regret this when the anger passed. I looked at her hand on my sleeve and gently moved away. I told her it was precisely because we were blood that this couldn't be forgiven. That strangers didn't owe my son anything but family did. That betrayal from someone who was supposed to protect him wasn't something time could soften. My father's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He just stared at the floor as if the right arrangement of words might still appear there. Behind me, Caleb shifted and rested his head against my shoulder. His fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt. The pressure was light, trusting. I felt it all the way through me. I said the conversation was over. They didn't move at first. My mother opened her mouth again, then stopped. Angela stood frozen, crying quietly now like she'd run out of arguments. For the first time, none of them tried to step inside. I closed the door. The sound wasn't dramatic. Just wood against frame. A latch sliding into place. On the other side, I heard muffled voices, then footsteps moving away. Inside the house was quiet. I stood there for a long moment, holding my son breathing in the ordinary air of an ordinary room. And I didn't open the door again. The case didn't end with sirens or headlines. It ended the way most real things do, slowly behind closed doors, in rooms that smelled like paper and old air. My parents and Angela were charged with felony child endangerment. The words looked unreal on the documents, like they belonged to another family. But the facts didn't bend. Timelines don't soften. Heat doesn't negotiate. They accepted a plea, probation, fines that meant nothing compared to what almost happened. A permanent prohibition from being alone with any minor without supervision. Angela's certification application was denied without appeal. Her name entered a system she used to believe existed for other people. I wasn't in the room when it was finalized. I didn't want to see their faces when it became official. I had already seen enough of them trying to save themselves. I cut contact completely, changed my number, blocked emails before they could arrive, told my lawyer to route everything through him. Silence felt unnatural at first, like walking after a long illness, unsteady, suspicious of every step. But it grew into something solid, protective. Caleb started therapy 3 weeks after we came home. The first sessions were quiet. He played with blocks, lined them up by color, knocked them down carefully as if even chaos needed rules. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he didn't. The therapist never pushed. She told me healing didn't announce itself. It shows up in small, ordinary ways. He stopped flinching when car doors closed. He stopped asking if he was in trouble when adults raised their voices. He slept through the night again most nights.